Hello. Today we're going to talk about systemic functional grammar. I'm Agostina Alessandro.
I am Marian Chacana.
Okay, we are going to focus on the functional perspective on grammar based on the work of Michael Holiday, who refers that language is not simple a collection of rules and labels for grammatical categories, but also a resource for making meaning through which we interactively shape and interpret our world and ourselves. The contribution of the systemic functional perspective consists of two different aspects. On one hand, we refer to the description, specification, and computational implementation of a systemic functional grammar fragment on German for the purpose of natural language generation. This is motivated by application to multilingual generation. And on the other hand, we've got a re-examination of the CFL theory in the domain of the logical metafunction based on the insights gained from the computational application, and its major motivation is a holistic view of language considered as a social semiotic or a way to remind and establish social relations. Okay, SFL takes into consideration the communicative situations, including its intention, its context, and its participant. We can also support SFL to the studies of different authors. The linguistic of Nichols' purpose of the speech event can be connected to the concept of gender, which is a type of context identified by its communicative purpose and its conventional form. We can also refer to Martin, who places genre, to the outermost layer of this SFL model of language and understand it as a situation of context. And also there asserts that within this context, there are patterns in the way we produce meaning. Okay, let's talk about a genre, which is a categorization of text that depends on external criteria dictated by the context, the users, and the use of a text typical of a discourse community. In everyday context, people interact to achieve different social purposes like greeting, thanking, informing, inviting, discussing, and so on, in different public and private spheres. In academic context, on the other hand, students have to use language to complete with academic purposes that include the provision of descriptions, narrations, exemplification, comparisons, and explanations also. Okay, according to the figure, register is in the central layer of the model and is associated with the organization of situations or immediate context and defined by linguistic characteristics. The systemic functional grammar model of language understands the concept of the register as the language produced based on the choices the language offers the users according to the situation. We can identify three key features in any context of situation: the feel, the tenor, and the mood. About the feel refers to the subject matter, in other words, to what the text is about. The tenor refers to the users of a language who fulfill their intentions in a particular context, sticking to socially stated forms. And finally, the mood refers to the channel of communication used to transmit the message. It can be oral or written, a combination of both, or visual and multimodal text. Okay, systemic functional grammar as a model of language describes how a language works to make meaning. It describes the relationship between grammatical forms and their functions. Language is a system of paradigmatic relations that account for the potential of linguistic expressions. Describing language as a system is one of the primary tasks of linguistic investigation. And the paradigmatic of languages have been described in very fine details in the systemic functional linguistic. However, the complementary line of linguistic description syntagmatic relations has not been worked out to the same level of details. Nevertheless, this may not be a problem in application of systemic functional grammar to do not require a high degree of explicitness. However, in computational applications, the syntagmatic gaps is developed clearly, and it also means providing a view to the theory and feedback to it the insights obtained from the theory as a metasemiosis.
Well, the first aspect that I'm going to talk about is background. Um, to begin with, systemic functional theory brings forth two convictions about language. One of them defines that language varies as its function varies. Um, Another aspect to take into account is that language also is a semiotic system and a process that defines meaning. That is why we can conceive of meta-language as categories set up to express our linguistic findings. What is more, meta-language also differs according to use, giving rise to meta-registers, as it were, meta-language uh, as a semiotic system and process that goes through cycles of semiosis. Um, Another thing to consider on this part of the theory is that systemic functional languages considers that linguistic system is a resource that is organized by stratification. That is why meta-language can be considered as a stratified resource in this sense. In this figure, we have the theoretical perspective, which is commonly associated with the nature of language. Also, we can find linguistic representation, which implies that the theoretical concepts are realized as an instrument for making linguistic descriptions. In systemic functional language, there are stratification, actual organization, the system network, etc. Since systemic functional language is not um, explicitly designed for computational application, there is no tradition to speak out in investigation the level of explicit computational representation. Uh, in Penman, this metastratum, collapse with implementation, which point out that we cross a line similar um, to the one between the grammatical stratum and phonology in this case. All the way, the meta-register of computational system linguistic is adjust. We can explain that it depends according to the requirements on the context in which is used. However, the meta-language system, is not stable due to the fact that is has continuously trying to accommodate the user's needs.
About theory and linguistic representation, we must include the metastrata of the theoretical perspective and linguistic representation of the systemic function of grammar. The main concern is with the metastratum of linguistic representation at the stratum of grammar, with grammatical paradigmatic relations encoded in system networks for all of three metafunctions. Interactual realization statement mapping paradigmatic choices to syntagmatic structures and the representation of syntagmatic relations itself.
Well, about theoretical perspective, we can say that systemic functional linguistics has certain characteristics, such as, first of all, the language is considered as a social semiotic. That is, we can only learn about how language works if we consider the way it is used in particular context, both cultural and situational. Sorry. Another aspect we consider here is that systemic functional linguistics advocates a view of language as a mean of doing. In this sense, language provides a linguistic behavior potential which is ultimately defined by the context of the culture. Using language is a choice among the linguistic possibilities determined by the context of culture and in a particular context of situation. What is more, another aspect that we consider here is that meaning derives from function in use or function in context because it's a general feature of semiotic systems that they develop function in a context. And that meaning is a product of the relationship between the system and the environment. Uh, Function in turn has various aspects that are fulfilled whenever language is used because whatever we are using the language for, we need to make reference to the categories of or experience. We need to take on some role of interpersonal situations, and we need to embody this in the form of the text. All three functions that are called meta functions are relevant because the speaker does not first decide to express some content and then go on and decide to what sort of message to build up of it. Speech and acts involve planning that is continuous and simultaneous at the same time in respect to the all functions of language. To sum up, we can say that language is a behavior potential, uh, constitutes meaning, and is multifunctional, and the choice is in the potential. Well, to talk about the system, we have to consider that the system is the general category that realizes that language has a potential. Uh, It is mean that it is basic means of representation, paradigmatic relations, encoding the linguistic options that are available in certain context. Um, what is more the early conception of systems for grammatical description was as a single set of choices available at particular places in a structure. They were conceived as a set of systems, system network, operating with a particular rank of grammatical unit as domain. Um, a system network implies that is in general a declarative representation of all the conceivable restrictions occurrence of a particular set of terms or features which characterize the domain for which they apply. And a system network consists of an entry or an input condition and output terms. The put terms present exhausting options. For instance, they are a finite set of which only one can be selected. That is why it could be that all the paradigmatic relations holding in a language can be represented as a system in this way. Therefore, the system as representation device both supports the view of language in use as choice and reflects the concept of language as a potential.
Okay. About stratification, we can say that it is the stratum of grammar that is commonly considered the core of the linguistic system. Given a systemic functional grammar's orientation to context and the notion of linguistic choice as being determined by context, the context in which the language is used also has linguistic relevance. There must be a way of relating context to the actual linguistic resources, such as grammar, and this relation is defined by means of stratification. The areas of linguistic investigation proper are semantics, grammar, and phonology.
Well, to talk about metafunctions, we can say that the functional diversity of language is acknowledged by the metafunctional hypothesis. That is, when we examine the potential of a language itself, we found that a vast number of options embodied into independent networks which correspond to certain basic functions of language. uh, we have three meta functions. These are the ideational, the interpersonal, and the textual. The ideational is concerned with the speaker's experience of the real world, while interpersonal serves to establish and maintain social relations, including speakers' assessment of the probability and the relevance of a message. Uh, and last, textual metafunction enable us as speakers or writers to construct text. It is concerned with establishing coherence and cohesion in text. All three metafunctions are of equal status. None of, none of them is more important or relevant than any other. They are simultaneously relevant of any structure um, of the linguistic system. At the stratum of grammar, at a close level, functional diversity is reflected in the systems of transitivity, ideational, mood, interpersonal, and theme, textual. Transitivity concerned with the process type encoding in a clause and the participants that are involved. Theme is related with the potential of placing certain elements in theme position and the point of departure for a clause. Um, the strata of the phonology, semantics, and context also have a meta-functional organization. The three relevant parameters defining situation types are field, tenor, and mode. Field is concerned with what is going on in situations, the whereabouts. While tenor is the interpersonal situations and the roles that participants adopt in a context. Uh, while mode, it is referring to the status assigned to the text, including the medium, the channel of communication.